let's get the elephant right out there, kids, and talk about the imminent fear that a lot of agriculture, not just our Wisconsin agriculture, but agriculture across the United States, sees when they see the Trump administration verbiage on illegal immigrants, migrants, whatever phrase you want to tag to it. I'm going to start with you, Cody, to get the ball rolling, because you see many different dairies, you see many different operations. You grew up in the industry and know how we've evolved reliance on those partners. And now, like I said, Becky bar the door, are we going to lose them? And some of these people have been with us, generational now.
Correct, and I don't think that doesn't just apply for agriculture. You got manufacturing, hospitality that deals with it. We look at Wisconsin and the university here has done in the study of work. There's 70,000 illegal immigrants in Wisconsin. Of those, 45,000, give or take, are employed. And of that, we rely on the dairy industry itself relies on 70% of its labor being the migrant workforce. So I don't think that, and that's migrant workforce, may I add. And so I think that it's a very vital and crucial thing that we discussed it today. There's a ton of angst. I mean, if you go in barns and farm offices across the state today and across the country, there is that imminent fear. That population doesn't understand the legal aspect of it, the deep-rooted political aspect of it that we do and the farm owners often see. And the farm owners need to be connected, and thank God for extension and the like for those types of activities, the things that you work on a daily basis as well. In the barn today, there's a lot of angst, and I reassure clients and I reassure my staff as well. The Lincoln Riley Act, which most likely will get passed this week, focuses on criminals in theft, shoplifting. That has nothing to do with evicting or deporting your standard normal person that has kids that are going to school here, that are citizens, the dreamers. They're not to be affected. We look deeper at what Trump and his administration has discussed and shown. We know Tom Homan, the director of ICE, he is focused heavy on criminals. And what is defined as a criminal? If you look really deep, you'll find that felonies and above are defined as criminals. For driving without a license, which we know is a major topic and a major issue for Hispanic labor in Wisconsin specifically, that doesn't qualify in that bucket. So the peace of mind comes from the fact that repeatedly, over and over and again, Trump said yesterday in his inaugural address, in mental institutions. Like, if you look at the verbiage and peel out those little layers from within that, we kind of see behind the veil of what the administration is focusing on. We know they're going to go into jails. We know they're going to go into prisons. We know they're going to go into mental institutions. We know that when people get arrested in jurisdictions supportive of deportation, those people that get arrested and convicted of crimes are going to be deported. That is very much what we see today. That does not apply to the vast majority of the immigrant labor on farms, as we understand. But I can honestly say that I expect there to be a lot of illegal criminals in the country, and that is certainly what we're seeing.
And if I can jump in to sort of riff off of that, there are the priorities that President Trump has identified, like you mentioned in his inaugural address. If you look at the executive order that was released yesterday, which I didn't read every word, but did get a quick sense, and because we had talked about the Lincoln Riley Act yesterday, I did pick up on the fact that the executive order yesterday did talk about, oh gosh, now I'm going to lose it, because detaining aliens apprehended on suspicion of violating state or federal law. So that's a step further from
Correct.
Just those who are convicted to go to those who are arrested on suspicion. That opens up, from a legal perspective, a lot more fear as well. So now you not only have the sort of cultural dynamics on the farm, if there is one, or even if there's no one employed at that operation who is really at quote-unquote true risk under the law for deportation. Is there a sibling, a nephew, a child, a parent? Who in that community do they know that they're waiting on the edge of their seat, hoping that I don't get a phone call that this person is gone and that they're not going to be there when I get home. You also then have to think about, and again, because we talk about the suspicion, I'm certainly a supporter of our law enforcement, but as we know, there are bad apples in any profession. And so do you know where someone is afraid because will they get picked up on a suspicion? And I will admit I have some bias on that front. My family has employed migrant labor on our farm for the last 25 years, and we've dealt with some of those situations. And that's a very scary situation to be in, but it's also really challenging as an employer because you don't think it's going to affect you necessarily until it does. And now you're thinking about if someone shows up to my farm, how is this interrupting my daily operations? Am I going to have folks that just take off? Am I going to have folks and they're out of the parlor even though milking is still going on because they've got something bigger that they need to deal with? And so I keep saying my word for the year, or my 2 words for the year, are resiliency and adaptation, being ready to flex to whatever changing regulation, changing enforcement might look like. And we talked about, of course, from the financial perspective, how do you ensure that you've got enough margin to adapt? But it's also a lot of adaptation on that human resources front for thinking about how you handle your employees, how you're and have backups. And of course, also thinking about who do you have to, quote unquote, let onto your property.
So I want you to slow down just for a second because I want Adam to get in on this because you are also in charge of directives. What farm manager, my rights, my responsibilities, documentation, hang on to that. Adam, you make relationships happen across parties, across agencies, near, regional, and abroad. Is this smoke? How alarmed about this as a threat to our food industry?
I mean, my perspective is probably one that everyone else has. The president ran on a campaign to be really judicious on this front. I think he's going to deliver on it. I hope what Cody says is right. It's going to be the first step. I think it is going to be more impactful. And I think everyone else in this room also knows, if you look at what's the unemployment rate for Wisconsin, 2.9%. Like, there's not a bunch of people looking for work. So I do think this is going to impact the ag industry. I can say within the organic sector, like, we do rely on a greater degree, especially in fruits and vegetables, because some of the inputs that we are not allowed to use aren't available to us. For our company as Organic Valley, I would say many of our patrons are more small to moderate scale. They're not using a lot of immigrant labor. My sense is this is going to be a central issue, and it's going to be one that's going to carry over for a couple years. I think you're going to have tiers, and we'll see how much that satisfies sort of the base and the experience that the president has. The message I would have to people in the room is if they're worried about this and they have concerns, they should speak to their members of Congress that are going to be able to get the president's ear. So,
And you believe that this ripple may not be limited to just the United States?
say more what you mean by that
Well,
question.
that if this catches on where protect our borders, protect our people, that some of our neighbors could go out, Canada, for example, and
Yeah, sure. I think that this is, the direction that we've had at the administrative level and the changeover is not unique to the United States, right? We're seeing this in a lot of other countries around the world. So I don't think that we're some unique.
so that's why, Kelly, again, let us assume this is something new that we will have to deal with, aside from everything else, in operating a farm. What do we need? What do you think we need to know? What kinds of resources are there? And what I'm reading and understanding is the resources are outstripped because of the anxiety of people in Chicago Sanctuary City that are trying to figure out if they're going to suddenly become victims of this mass move.
Yeah, so I won't pretend to be an immigration lawyer by any means, but what I do in my role as a farm law outreach specialist with UW Extension is a lot of interpretation, right? Giving a sense of what are some of the things that farmers might need to think about. And so when we think about this issue in particular, I like to actually equate it to when we think about, and I know we've in the room, but when we think about, is the EPA or DATCAP or the DNR going to show up at my farm today? And if they do, what are my rights? How much do I have to take them around the farm? What do I have to show them? Do I have to let them into my computer, my barn, my nutrient management plan? And the same apply here, just like we, and I say we meaning the legal industry, typically advises folks to handle those agency inquiries. The same thing is true when you're looking at ICE, Immigration's Customs Enforcement, or the Department of Labor, is how do you ensure that you've already identified what works in that space, that you've got their number handy, and you've got a relationship, even if it's just a passing relationship with them, that when someone shows up, you can call them for that guidance and that advice to look at, do I have a judicial warrant where I need to let them go through the property? Or is this just an administrative? I don't really have to give them a whole lot. It's just that if they find that person, they're probably taking them with. So that's really one of the biggest steps that farms can take as they're preparing, is figure out who that person is to get on call. There are certainly lots of nonprofit organizations that are prepping sort of the no information and distributing it to farm workers. I think it's a really great space for our farmers to think about looking into as well, as sort of the allies and the folks that are relying on these employees to get so many of our jobs done. But aside from that very, specific, farm-specific section, the other thing that's going to be really interesting about this is to see how much really can be done just on a single administration push. And certainly, the president and the executive branch sets a lot of our policy agenda. But if we talk about, for example, even the executive order that came out yesterday, birthright citizenship for children of non-citizens, even if they're in the U.S. legally. There was a lawsuit filed already today by 18 states who are pushing back on that and essentially alleging that just like student loan forgiveness or some of the COVID mandates, that the executive branch this on their own. That's not a change that they can make, that it would have to go to Congress. So I think we're going to see in labor and in a lot of these actions some fighting back and forth, some push and pull between our branches of government until we figure out exactly what's going to happen.
Fighting
Not
between
government.
branches?
Checks and balances.
One thing that Adam brought up is, what is posturing? Are you just eliciting this so that 18 states will do this? Or what is like sincere, like you said, he ran a campaign, this was the wanted, but how much of it is, like the grow soda on the field, all puffed up?
It's impact politics at that point. What is the impact of the statement? What is the impact of the threat? And as you said, what does it really mean? I mean, he's going to go to the border and he's going to put up a wall. I mean, I think that we know that he's going to do that. Us in the past that he's done that in his prior administration. So we can glean some ideals from what he's done in the past. When it came to immigration and deportation in the past, whilst he wanted a lot of this, he wasn't able to push through it for a lot of the reasons you stated, Kelly, and a lot of these will get tried. That's an amendment issue of the Constitution as it comes to birthright citizenship. I personally feel that'll be very hard to push through. Right? We're going to see that tried and tried again. It's going to go to court, which will slow down this process of this actually occurring. Yeah. So they're going to try the things they can do first that they actually have, which is why they focus on criminals. They can deport criminals today, no problem. It's easy to get that through, make a scene, make a show, put down some force, we did this, and then move on from there and see what they can take next. That's the way I look at it from that standpoint.
Well, like I said, chime in anytime, and you as well in the audience, that you're very motivated about personal experiences, you've got employees, or you have questions or are curious about anything that the three can address, don't wait for your cue. Come to the middle here. I want to pivot for just a moment and settle that down for a second and go back to something that we started with, and that's trade. I think everybody in this room, regardless of what you raise or are invested in, is anxious about what this looks like. And again, Adam, I'm going to go to you because you've probably got the greatest depth of knowledge across many different parties, affiliations. You've been working this beat for quite a little while. And as before the election, in the election, after the election, you've been working your contacts to get a true sense on trade. And what do you hear? What about target areas? Is it going to be industrial? Is it going to be cars, trucks, steel? What are you hearing? Is agriculture as small as the numbers that, you know, Chuck and those guys were talking about, or are we in the conversation?
Well, I think agriculture is in the conversation whether we want to be or not. Whether it's exports or imports or it's retaliatory tariffs. I mean, I just think that's table stakes at this point, and that would be experience that we've seen in the last Trump administration as well. So, you know, for the organic sector, we have a little bit different of an experience. We're largely a domestically focused industry. So if you think about the $70 billion in organic trade, most of that was in the U.S. Now we are vulnerable to especially like feedstuffs that come in. So about 70% that feed the livestock industry of organics is imported. You know, kind of in the other space, the same would be said for beef. A lot of organic beef is imported into the U.S. I would say in terms of exports, again, we're pretty domestically focused. You know, should we expect? I'm looking at the same news articles you all are. And, you know, Nick, you talked about it earlier that we saw the administration or Trump hint at a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico yesterday. I think he's going to make good on it. I don't have any reason to believe he wouldn't. And it's a blanket one, Pam, or whether it's specific to a particular sector. I don't know that I have very much more visibility than anyone else. I think he's going to use tariffs. If you looked at Under Secretary Bessett's confirmation, he said we're going to look to remedy unfair practices that we feel are impacting our surplus or deficits. We're going to use it to create a revenue source for the federal government. And third, it's going to be a tool for negotiating other trade agreements and other standards.
And to that point, was a tool to help manage immigration or illegal immigration as a weapon.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. And that's exactly what the Treasury Secretary said.
Correct. Yeah.
So can we find positives coming in? I mean, one thing we talked about last night was some of the tax incentives. That's not the right way to look at it.
Revenues?
Provisions.
Yeah. That might become, if they look like they were going away, they might come back with a roar and be put in place. Is that?
Well,
yeah.
maybe one area you could see or postulate, which is if exports for grain crops are lessened, you would have lower feed costs in the U.S., and you might have strong dairy prices, so you would have better margins. People want to look for an upshot, there's a potential upshot. Now, would you still have dairy? I'm not sure.
Inheritance tax.
Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So before I jump into that, I want to segue off of the trade conversation. One of the interesting things when we look at history is that presidents are typically more effective. I'm not saying policy perspective, but more effective at accomplishing their agenda goals in a second term. So essentially, if we look at Trump, we can expect he's potentially going to be more effective this term. And because he didn't have 2 consecutive terms, we can probably assume he spent the additional 4 years hopefully learning and thinking about how he wanted to pursue this. The challenge, of course, has been that we don't have a lot of clarity on what his policy goals are. They have changed from time to time, and sometimes they change very quickly. Tax, however, like you mentioned, has been one topic where he's remained fairly consistent. If we Cuts and Jobs Act of 2018, which was passed under the last administration. That package had a number of provisions that are set to sunset, meaning they'll expire or go away in 2026. So things like your increased standard deduction on your personal income tax, some of the tax bracket changes. When we talk about agriculture and our farm households, those are important provisions, as well as the QBI deduction, the qualified business income deduction, and bonus depreciation, which are all topics which the Trump administration, Republican Party have talked about. Could we come back and make these permanent? Those items all did increase farm household income, so certainly a positive. The other big topic related to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was the estate and gift tax exemption. So the tax cuts ratcheted that number up to for 2025, $13.99 million of exemption per person that you can pass through before there's any estate tax due. With that expected to sunset, that means in 2026, we're going to $1 million per person exemption. What does that mean for farms? Under the decreased exemption, the USDA Economic Research Service speculated, or estimated, I should say, that it'll be about 0.3% of farm estates that are going to have estate tax due. So fairly, let me rephrase that. That's under the increased exemption. Under the decreased exemption, they're looking at about 1%. So estate tax is usually not, quote unquote, as big of a deal as we think it is in agriculture. But that being said, for the 1% of farms that it impacts, it's a big deal.
So let me just speak to the budget package.
Yeah.
I think we're in a unique place where we do have a trifecta, and typically when a president has a trifecta, they use budget reconciliation to advance their priorities.
Yeah.
That is going to be front and center in the next 3 months.
Yeah.
And whether it's a one big beautiful bill or it's a couple of bills, none of us really have a good insight to that. But I do think it's going to mean that, you know, the average American's going to have a little bit more disposable income. So for a value-added consumer good like us, we're excited about that prospect. People are going to take that dollar in their disposable income and buy. So I'm encouraged by that. I also think it does set us in a place that means a farm bill is going to be increasingly difficult in 2025 because they're probably going to look at, and people already talked about this, what does the SNAP as well as the IRA funding, what is two big pieces of funding that didn't get rolled into the extension. Now SNAP, as you all many know, that kind of has a 10-year timeline. It has a lot longer spending timeline than any 1 year, and even if a farm bill expires, it's an entitlement, so it doesn't go away, just like Title I program payments. But the administration, reconciliation, and Congress can make a decision on how they want to use those dollars.
And Adam, maybe important to mention too, so the news cycle, or at least the news cycle that the algorithm fed me, made a really big deal about the fact that we have both chambers of Congress controlled by the same, and sort of this excitement that, oh, this should make it easier to get things done. Unfortunately, if you look at the numbers, that's not quite the reality. So in the House, you have 218 Republicans, 215 Democrats, and 2 vacancies. So what does that mean? That basically means Republicans can lose members to get something passed. That's not a real wide margin. They've got a little wider margin in the Senate, but there's still a significant need for some bipartisan work here.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the end of the year spending package that we're all familiar with, a couple of dozen Republicans on that bill. You know, and now we just need, you know, Chip Roy and Tom Massey to bail, and you'd be on thin ice in budget reconciliation.
On your positive note, Pam, as we look at that, the IRA and the Job Care Act, the extension of those is huge for RNG. RNG is obviously a growing industry on our dairy farms and our hog operations and across the country, but primarily in Wisconsin, we've seen a massive expansion in RNG facilities on our dairy farms. And the investment tax credit provisions that are instilled in those items, specifically as it relates to nuclear, solar,
Yeah.
and the like, those, if they get extended with the Job Care Act, the IRA gets, extended, those provisions will continue to help our farms immensely. Most farms over 2,000 to 3,000 cows can expect a digester and RNG project on their facility if those get expanded. And Trump has said over and over again that while he's drill baby drill, he wants all energy increase, all forms of energy, all energy, all energy. That means that as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's, again, like as you said, value-added proposition if we're
Correct.
bringing something back.
Despite